We're going to start in Isaiah 52 at verse 13. You can find the passage if you're using one of our church Bibles on page 523. And we'll get into this a little bit more, but this is the fourth of four servant songs in the book of Isaiah, and I'll explain what I mean by that in just a little bit. All right, verse 13 of chapter 52. See, my servant will act wisely. He will be raised up and lifted up and exalted highly. Just as there were many who were appalled at him, his appearance was so disfigured beyond that of any man, and his form marred beyond human likeness. So he will sprinkle many nations, and kings will shut their mouths because of him. For what they were not told, they will see, and what they have not heard, they will understand. Who has believed our message, and to whom has the arm of the Lord been revealed? He grew up before him like a tender shoot, and like a root out of dry ground. And I want to stop right here. And those of you who maybe are here today, you might not know this, but every once in a while I just take a long detour where it looks like I'm talking about things that don't even relate. And I promise I will come back and help you understand. We're going to continue reading this passage in just a little bit. But I want to stop there. There's something shocking, just shocking about this passage. I mean, verse 1 of chapter 53, it asks this question like, who would believe what's written here? Like, who would have ever thunk it? Who would have ever thought what is about to be said here could ever take place? And then in verse 2, these words, and I'm going to take a long detour to help describe what these words are all about. But these words in verse 2, he grew up before him like a tender shoot, like a root out of dry ground. Okay, here I start my detour. I would like to just get a bigger picture. We're going to zoom out here for a little bit and talk about Isaiah. Isaiah was a prophet. He was actually living in Jerusalem during the time of many kings. We're told that he was of sort of royal heritage, which meant that he was very close to the kings in which he had his ministry. He prophesied and preached a message of God's righteousness and his mercy and grace for many, many years to kings. And the very beginning of Isaiah, and if you were here 2 weeks ago when we kind of got going on this series, at the very beginning, King Ahaz is the king in Judah. And I made mention of this in sort of just a passing reference, but Ahaz was an exceedingly wicked king. God's people, the Israelites, they had been called to be a light to the nations. In fact, that's one of the key words in the book of Isaiah, that God's people, they had been put where they had been put, they had been placed where they had been placed, so that they could be a light to all the other nations and show off God. And as you read through the Bible, what you realize is that after God brought them out of slavery and took them into that land and made them his people and gave them his law and asked them to be a light to the nation, that they failed miserably and became exceedingly wicked, and that it's the kings, the leaders of the people, who led the people down the wrong road. And Ahaz was one of the kings in the early chapters of Isaiah who was just exceedingly wicked. I'm going to put some verses on the screen from 2 Kings chapter 16. These are verses 2 and 3. And these are the words that are written there. Unlike David, his father, Ahaz did not do what was right in the eyes of the Lord his God. He walked in the ways of the kings of Israel, and he even sacrificed his son in the fire, following the detestable ways of the nations the Lord had driven out before the Israelites. Now, you may want to do this, and that is turn back to Isaiah chapter 9 while I'm talking, because I'm eventually going to come around to some of these early chapters again. This was Ahaz, and if you were here a couple weeks ago, I made some passing reference to these verses, and I pointed out this phrase, he even sacrificed his son in the fire, which, I mean, just the impact of those words themselves. But a couple of weeks ago, I was actually at a banquet, and the speaker, he spoke about what happened in that time. And it just struck me so much that I want to share more about these words with you. You see, at that time, some of the nations of the world, they followed this god called Molech. And actually, Molech, he was an idol. There was large statues of him that were set up, made out of bronze. And he was a god who actually, if you ever saw a statue, his hands were stretched out like this. And he's actually seated. In fact, I'm going to put a picture here on the screen in a minute, but there was a fire that was underneath his hands. And if you were a follower of Molech, then what you would do is, in order to follow him and show your devotion, you would bring one of your infant children. And while the fire was blazing, you would set your infant child in his hands, where that child would burn. And just so, I don't want to be overly graphic or gruesome, but, I'm stuck. Someone back in the sound booth who can help me out here. You guys can advance slides for me. I want to just go to the next slide, which is the picture. This is an artist's rendering of Molech. There we go. You can see the kind of statue that would have been made and what people would do, bringing their infants. You see the fire in his lap. The hands would be heated up. And you're going to have to stay there because I don't think I'm going now. All right, great, thank you. One of the Jewish commentators, ancient Jewish commentators, his name was Rashi, he wrote about what it was that people did when they sacrificed their sons to Molech. He said this: Molech was made of brass. They heated him from his lower parts, and his hands being stretched out and made hot, they put the child between his hands, and it was burnt. The child vehemently cried out, but the priest beat a drum that the father might not hear the voice of his son, and his heart might not be moved. So when you hear Ahaz, the king of Israel, sacrificed his son in the fire, this is the kind of wickedness that God's people had fallen into. Jeremiah 32, another prophet, he speaks about this whole situation. He says this: the people of Israel and Judah have done nothing but evil in my sight from their youth. And the people of Israel have done nothing but provoke me with what their hands have made, declares the Lord. They've built high places for Baal in the valley of Ben Hinnom to sacrifice their sons and daughters to Molech. Then I want you to hear these words: though I never commanded, nor did it enter my mind that they would do such a detestable thing and so make Judah sin. You hear these words? God's like, in all my imagination, God is an all-knowing God. In all my thoughts, and God's an all-knowing, he knows everything. These are the words. It's like, I could have never imagined that my own people that I bought with a price and took them out of Egypt and made them my people and I blessed, I could have never imagined that they would then take their children and do such a detestable thing. And so King Ahaz, when you read this, he even sacrificed his own son in the fire. That's what that is a level of wickedness that is happening in Israel when Isaiah the prophet is called by God to go and preach a message. And anyway, he preaches to Ahaz, who really doesn't listen. And if you're with me in chapter 9 again, we talked about this. I'm stuck again, guys. You might just stay there if that could help. We talked about this last time. Of course, at that time, one of Isaiah's message was something like this, like, we've got to look for someone else. This is a wicked, terrible king. And if you go to the next slide, 2 Samuel chapter 7, there was this promise that had been made to David, and Isaiah was aware of it. This was the promise. The Lord declares to you that the Lord himself will establish a house for you. I will raise up for your offspring to succeed you, who will come from your own body. He is the one who will build a house for my name. I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. Isaiah, totally aware of this message, that God, he would raise up this righteous and good king in the line of David, whose throne would be established. And so in Isaiah chapter 9, he begins to say things like this in verse 6. For to us a child is born, to us a son is given. The government will be on his shoulder. He'll be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. Of the increase of his government and peace, there'll be no end. He's going to reign on David's throne and over his kingdom, establishing and upholding it with justice and righteousness, that at that time forward, the zeal of the Lord Almighty accomplishes. So you get it, right? Like, Ahaz is wicked. We're doomed. We're lost with kings like this. There was this, I'll put it this way, this yearning for another child to be born, another king who won't be like this wicked king who's doing these detestable things, but who will lead his people toward righteousness and peace. Does that make sense? Okay, I'm still on my detour, but I'm going to go in another direction. So I'm detouring from my detour. Um, if you read the Old Testament, it is possible to get so confused because you have to know some things about history. And I'm going to just, here we go. No, there we go. There are a succession of kingdoms that because of Israel's wickedness, God allowed to occupy and to rule over the nation of Israel from like the time of the year 700 BC forward. So in about 720 BC, and we talked about this last time, Assyria, which was this worldwide empire ruled by this guy named Tiglath-Pileser III, came in at the request of Ahaz, king of Judah, and destroyed the 10 northern tribes. That happened in about 720 BC. And we talked about the 10 lost tribes of Israel. Where'd they go? They were wiped off the map. And that was what prompted Isaiah to write these words, because it was actually Ahaz's fault that those 10 tribes were lost. We need a better king. We need someone who's not so wicked. We need a child who's going to be a wonderful counselor, mighty God, everlasting Father, Prince of Peace, so that he'll establish righteousness and justice. That's Assyria. Assyria as a worldwide empire, and you can just read about this in the history books, right? I mean, maybe some of you just can't stand and did not stand 8th grade history, but this is just a little recap of what happened. Assyria was conquered by another empire, the Babylonian Empire. And actually what happened, and it's in 587 BC, Nebuchadnezzar, who was the emperor of Babylon, came in and destroyed Jerusalem, broke down its temple, destroyed its walls, and carried the people away into exile. And the reason I'm mentioning this is these are kind of the events that happen in biblical history and are even surrounding this prophet Isaiah. In fact, the first 39 chapters are about really Assyria and what happens in that time period. Chapters 40 through 66 are really about Babylon and what happens in that time period. Anyway, you should just know this, that the Babylonian Empire was finally defeated by the Persian Empire. And that actually plays into biblical history because it's actually the emperor of Persia, whose name was Cyrus, who issued an edict that people could return to Jerusalem. God's people could return to Jerusalem for the first time. That Persian Empire ruled over Jerusalem and God's people from about 539 BC to about the 330s BC. And then maybe some of you, this you may remember from 8th grade history class, there was this fellow named Alexander the Great, and the Greeks came onto the scene, and he had this huge worldwide campaign, and he came and he defeated the Persians. And the Greeks took over that land and God's people, and they occupied that place. And I mean, there was this massive Hellenization, and maybe you're aware of this, that the New Testament was actually written in Greek, and that's because the Greeks had such a worldwide influence. It so happens, and this is, I want to just tell you this because it's going to play into what we're about to talk about, that God's people, that they were never satisfied that they were occupied by some foreign force. They believed that they were God's people and they were to be a light to the nations. And there was this family called the Maccabees, who in the 160s led a revolt and gained independence in Israel from about 160 BC to about 63 BC before the Romans, with Julius Caesar and Augustus Caesar and makes a nice salad, but also it was a Roman Empire, right? Came in and reoccupied them, and at the time of Jesus' life, of course, Israel was occupied by the Romans. But there was this time period from 160 to 63 BC where they gained their independence by the family of the Maccabees. And actually, I don't know if you're aware of this, but there's a Jewish holiday, Hanukkah, which remembers those days. Anyway, I just point this out to you because you've got to sort of have this framework in your mind of history to pick up what's being talked about. And by the way, let's just talk about this Maccabean era. And again, it's going to feel like I'm taking a detour. But maybe I can put it this way. So here's Isaiah prophesying, and he's saying, look, you guys are so wicked. God is going to allow you to be destroyed. And how about a picture? I'm not a very good drawer, but I gave it my best go. This is my picture of a tree. And one of the reasons I do this is because throughout the Old Testament, actually God's people, kingdoms, are pictured as like this really big tree. In fact, maybe you remember Jesus' parable of the mustard seed. He talked about how those, even the smallest of seeds, it would grow up and become this big tree where birds would kingdoms were pictured as large trees. And Isaiah had this message: you are going to be cut down. And again, my drawing might not be that good, but hopefully it'll just stick in your mind. You'll say, man, he's a bad drawer, but you remember what I drew. That's the message of Isaiah. You are going to be cut down. You're wicked. God's going to destroy you. Why won't you listen? And of course, the people never do. And Assyria first destroys the northern kingdom, then Babylon destroys the southern kingdom. I want you to look with me at Isaiah chapter 11. So, this is my new picture after you turned there. You used to look like this. This is going to happen to you, and by the way, in history, it did. They were destroyed, they were cut down, so that's the stump with the branches just sort of laying there on the ground. And I want to just read from Isaiah chapter 11, because even when Isaiah prophesies judgment, this is what's going to happen. He holds to that promise in 2 Samuel 7. A king is going to come. Some descendant of David's going to come. And this is what he says: a shoot will come up from the stump of Jesse. Jesse, by the way, was David's father. So he's basically saying, someone in the line of David, you're going to get cut down to a stump, but a shoot will come up from the stump of Jesse. From his roots, a branch will bear fruit. And then it says, the Spirit of the Lord will rest on him, a spirit of wisdom and of understanding, a spirit of counsel and of power, a spirit of knowledge and the fear of the Lord. He'll delight in the fear of the Lord. There's going to be one who comes. It's not like the wicked kings we have now. He's going to be in the line of David. We can look forward to him. And I should just say this. And man, to me, this is fascinating. So in Hebrew, you can see here in verse 11, the word branch is capitalized. The Hebrew word for branch is the word netzer. And Hebrew just works on a consonant system. Maybe the three consonants that we could roughly put in English are N, Z, R. N, Z, R, netzer. And I mentioned this. Let me go back to my previous slide here. In the Maccabean era, the Maccabees, they won independence. And they won independence not only in Jerusalem, but also up in Galilee. And of course, at that time, the 10 lost tribes, they're lost. So all there were people from the tribe of Judah. They decided, since the Maccabees gained independence for that Galilee area, that some people should move up there and settle in those places. And there was a small family from the line of David who went up and settled in a town. And actually, archaeology confirms this, that it was in this time period of the Maccabean area, because they've dug up in this area. They settled in this town, and they called it Netzerville. That's the name they gave to the town. They believed in this prophecy so much that they actually called their town, because they were people who were in the line of David, they called it Netzerville, like Branchville. Nazareth. Maybe some of you remember where Jesus grew up, right? In Nazareth, Branchville, because they believed this prophecy. Anyway, that's a fascinating detour. By the way, my detour is over. Back to Isaiah 53. Now that we've said this, okay, Isaiah, he just has this unwavering belief that although God's people are wicked and they're going to get cut down, he has this unwavering belief that God is going to raise someone up. And let me just go back to my slides here. This is the picture. This is the hope. This is what we have to look for. Although it's cut down, there's the shoot, this branch that's going to come up. All right, I've got to get to Isaiah 53 myself. Give me 2 seconds. Dun, dun, dun. You're faster than I am. Good job. Okay, verse 1. Who would have possibly ever believed this message? And to whom the arm of the Lord has been revealed. He grew up before him like a tender shoot, like a root out of dry ground. Do you see the connection here? Okay, there's someone coming, this Netzer. He's the one, he's our hope. And by the way, just so you know this, the first half of Isaiah is prophesying things like this branch is going to come. He's going to be, wonderful counselor, mighty God, everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. In the second half of Isaiah, there are these 4 servant songs that speak about this servant. And I'm just going to point out to you where they are. If you want to study Isaiah a little more, there are these 4 passages that speak about this servant who's going to come and who's going to do God's will, and he's going to establish justice and righteousness and finally lead in the way. He's a son of David who's going to come. And now that you're that far, I'm going to put this picture back up on the screen. You will not believe what Isaiah says is going to happen to this person. Verse 3. He was despised and rejected by men. He was a man of sorrows and familiar with suffering. Like one from whom men hide their faces, he was despised, and we esteemed him not. Surely he took up our infirmities and carried our sorrows, yet we considered him stricken by God, smitten by him, and afflicted. He was pierced for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities. The punishment that brought us peace was upon him. By his wounds we're healed. We all like sheep have gone astray. Each of us has turned to his own way, and the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all. He was oppressed and afflicted, yet he did not open his mouth. He was led like a lamb to the slaughter, and as a sheep before his shearers is silent, so he did not open his mouth. By oppression and judgment he was taken away, and who can speak of his descendants? For he was cut off from the land of the living. For the transgression of my people he was stricken. He was assigned a grave with the wicked, and with the rich in his death, though he had done no violence, nor was any deceit in his mouth. It was the Lord's will to crush him and cause him to suffer. And though the Lord makes his life a guilt offering, he will see his offspring and prolong his days, and the will of the Lord will prosper in his hand. After the suffering of his soul, he will see the light of life and be satisfied. By his knowledge, my righteous servant will justify many, and he will bear their iniquities. Therefore, I will give him a portion among the great. He'll divide the spoils with the strong, because he poured out his life unto death and was numbered with the transgressors. For he bore the sin of many and made intercession for the transgressors. This is such a remarkable passage, and I just want to encourage you, if you have time at some point, to just slowly meditate on all these words. And, of course, I can't hide it from you. This is so closely aligned with the life of Jesus. Just some of the details here. That he was assigned a grave with the wicked and with the rich in his death, that he was actually buried in a rich man's tomb. He was pierced for our transgressions. The Hebrew word there means to be pierced through, as though, something enters one part and goes out the back. There's such a remarkable correspondence between this passage and what finally happens to Jesus. And I want to invite you to think about those things. But here's what I want to point out. This passage is so shocking. All throughout Isaiah just keeps saying, someone's going to come. Someone is going to come. This person's wicked and we're oppressed and this country's falling apart and we're going to get cut off. But someone's going to come. It'll be cut down to a stump, but there'll be this little shoot that comes up. When that shoot comes up, that's when we're going to have something. And then when he describes this shoot. 3 quick thoughts. 1, the violence of this passage. I already talked about how he's pierced, run through. He's crushed. He's got wounds. He's oppressed. He's afflicted. He's caused to suffer. Just go through here and just read what happens to him. The early part talks about how we're appalled because his appearance becomes so disfigured. Isaiah basically says, you know what's going to happen to him? That shoot, that tender shoot, which is our hope, is going to get crushed, pierced, destroyed, smitten, suffer, struck. I mean, that wasn't what you were expecting, was it? No. It wasn't. Who would have ever believed our message? That's how this passage starts. Violence. Second, I think I should point this out. I'll do it briefly. The voluntary nature with which this servant goes through these things. Surely he took up our infirmities, is verse 4. He carried our sorrows. I mean, it's an active thing. It's not like he was forced to. He took them up. He carried them himself. Third quick thought. The way in which this servant is a substitute. I mean, let me just start at verse 4. Surely he took up our infirmities. He carried our sorrows. We consider him stricken by God, smitten and afflicted, but he was pierced for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities. You see that? It wasn't because he'd done wrong. It wasn't because he was unrighteous. It was because of us. It was our sin. It was our iniquity. It was our transgressions. And let me just, a couple pictures back, if I can get there. Okay, this is the picture. This is what's going to happen. And when it does happen, I would suggest to you that if you really read the Bible and you kind of take it in, you really have mixed emotions about this. On the one hand, you have a king who's offering his baby to Molech on the fire, and I mean, isn't there something inside of you that says, God, you've got to do something about that? You've got to cut them down. You've got to carry out justice. You've got to smite them. There's one part of us that when this happens, we cheer, yes, the world's right. But it's mixed because, I mean, if you read this, isn't this sad? This picture, like, what a waste, what a tragedy. The people of God who are supposed to be a light to the nations, who are supposed to show off the goodness of God, I mean, they're just gone. They're just gone. And so I think as you read through the Old Testament, you get to the exile where Jerusalem's being destroyed, and there's a part of you that says, yes, that's right. Way to go, God. And there's another part of you that says, well, whoa, hold on. What's happening? And I would suggest that you're caught between a tension between the justice of God and the love of God. I mean, anybody who understands God, who thinks about this world and all its wrongs and everything we go through, just cries out for the justice like, the wars that are happening now. You see what's happening with ISIS over there. Isn't there a part of you who's like, destroy them? Isn't there? And I mean, you don't have to think about over there. What about in your own life, the people who stab you in your back and do you wrong and lie and cheat? Don't you want God to do something and set this world straight? Yes, we do. And by the way, when it comes to religion, there's a whole brand of people who I'll just call the moralists. They wind up becoming the really judgmental people who say, you know what, this world is just full of injustice, and I'm not going to be one of them, and I'm going to do what's right. I'm going to not do that anymore. I'm going to do this. And they wind up looking down their nose at everyone who doesn't live the way they do, right? They love the justice of God. And they believe that I'm a good person and other people are bad people, and God's finally going to accept me because I'm good. By the way, they're bound to destruction because the truth is every one of us is a sinner. The Bible says, for all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. There's not one of us who's righteous, not even one. We've all turned aside. We've all become unrighteous, the Bible says. Then, there are those who really, they emphasize and they love the love of God. And by the way, this is probably most Americans today. Just believe, hey, God's a loving God, right? And of course he accepts me the way that I am. And, who are you, judgmental person over there, to tell me that I'm doing wrong and God won't accept me? And he loves. He's a God of love. And by the way, these people also are bound for destruction, and they wind up generally ruining their own life because they don't realize that all the things they're doing wrong are ultimately hurting themselves. And that kind of love of God that they talk about never motivates them because it isn't costly. Oh, he loves everyone, right? It is only this message, Isaiah 53, that finally puts those things together. There is this God who will execute justice, and there's this God who loves. He's going to execute justice on that branch, that shoot that comes up, so that all those who've fallen away can be brought back. And maybe I put it this way. So if you were to read Acts chapter 8, there's a just awesome story there. There is this man from Africa who came to Jerusalem in order to worship in the temple. And actually, it was from Ethiopia, and at that time and in that day, to travel from Ethiopia all the way to Jerusalem in order to worship God, I mean, you would have had to really be motivated. We're told that he was actually a eunuch. He was a servant of the queen of Ethiopia. That meant that he was castrated willingly, and at that time, if you were going to serve in a royal family, often this happened because they didn't want you to be a threat to any of the royals. They didn't want you acting inappropriately, and so you'd voluntarily become a eunuch, and that was his thing. And he obviously was a seeker. You know, he was missing something spiritually. He was looking for God, and so he traveled all the way to Jerusalem. What we know, as we learn about history, is that when he got to Jerusalem, he would have almost certainly been turned away. Because at the temple at that time, no one who was disformed or defigured could have even gotten into the temple. And he would not have been allowed to come into the presence of God because he had been castrated. And actually, we find him as he's traveling back. And there actually happens to be this Christian missionary. His name is Philip. And he sees the caravan of this Ethiopian official. And he comes up to him. And he just stays near. And that Ethiopian eunuch, he's actually riding along in the caravan. And he has open before him a portion of the Bible. And he's reading out loud from Isaiah 53. And Philip says, "Hey, do you understand what you're reading?" And he says, "How can I unless someone explains it to me?" Is this Isaiah, was he talking about himself or someone else? And you know what Acts chapter 8 says? That Philip began to tell him the good news of Jesus Christ. That he came to accept Jesus by listening to this passage and the explanation, and he was baptized on the spot. And here's the thing, here's this spiritual seeker who had just come up against a holy God, who was told he wasn't worthy, he couldn't enter. Yet he was seeking for love. And Philip said, "Hey, you got to understand something. This passage was speaking of Jesus. He took up our infirmities. He carried our burdens. He was smitten for our transgressions. He suffered the justice of God so that we could be loved." And I guess this is the thing. It's only the gospel, the message of Christianity, the message of this Bible, that finally gets it right because it both upholds the justice of God and also the love of God. If you only uphold the justice of God, you'll just be puffed up with pride. It's only when you acknowledge that you're a sinner and that you're humbled to the ground that you can finally understand the gospel. And yet at the same time, it's also the love of God that affirms you to the sky. God sent his son Jesus to die in our place. He loves you so much. And it's only when you hold those two things together that you admit, I am lost. I am wicked. I am unrighteous. And yet I am loved beyond any imagination that God would send this tender shoot to die in my place. It's only when you hear both those things that your life will be radically changed. And, who would have ever believed this message? And yet this is exactly what happened when Jesus came. He died to take away our sins. And the message of the Bible is this, is if that you'll put your faith in him, if you put your trust in him, if you'll connect your life to him, then God will reconnect you to himself and you'll live forever eternally with him. And by the way, 700 years before Jesus was ever born, these words were written. Would you put your faith and trust in him today?